on to Sarah. So Sarah is an assistant professor in applied forest ecology and silviculture in the Forest and Rangeland Stewardship Department at Colorado State University, and she's recently joined us and we're very excited to have her. Her research largely focuses on the interaction between insect epidemics and wildfire and how these two disturbances are changing forests in the Rocky Mountains. So Sarah, thank you so much for being with us, and I'll let you take it from here.
Great, thanks for that good introduction. You guys can hear me okay? Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to kind of build off a lot of these topics that have already been introduced, but I'm going to try and focus a little bit on aspen here to give you a little bit of a different flavor. And my talk today has been inspired by a lot of conversations with two great postdocs, Kyle Rodman, who's currently working with me, and Robbie Andrus, who is at Washington State University. So first, to start, as has been nicely highlighted, the current context for this is these 2020 fires that burned in a lot of these subalpine forests. In particular, if we look at this, we can see that relative to kind of previous fires, like Camille nicely pointed out, these fires are burning in a lot of our high elevation subalpine fir, Engelmann spruce, lodgepole pine, and aspen forests. And so this kind of creates this new question about kind of how these forests are going to respond and recover. And to kind of reiterate a little bit about what's been brought up, first I'll just say that conifer regeneration in the subalpine is often slow, even for conifers that can produce serotinous cones like Chuck was just talking about. We can see that regeneration of lodgepole pine can occur over like a 20-year period. And further studies that have been done by Kyle Rodman, as well as Tom Veblen, who's on this call, have shown that aerial imagery suggests that these subalpine forests can be recovering for 100 years following fire. So these are slow systems, and the actual establishment may occur over decades, which makes kind of figuring out how these forests are going to respond a little bit challenging. And regeneration in the subalpine is particularly slow for species without canopy seed banks. And by that, I mean some of these subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce species, which rely upon seed being dispersed from the unburned edge. So the seeds don't persist within that burned stand. So we really are dependent upon seed moving into that system, which means that it can be even slower. Further, spruce and fir tend to be a little bit slower in growing than our lodgepole pine. So you can see this kind of illustrated by this photograph here. Our other major player in the subalpine is aspen. And aspen is a prolific post-fire sprouter. So while many of the trees are killed, the root systems persist, and that allows kind of rapid establishment in these systems. So you can see this is a photograph where we're about 5 years post-fire, and you can see kind of just this sea of aspen sprouts across this system. So the question that I'm kind of going to talk about today is, when does aspen's ability to resprout following wildfire lead to shifts in forest type, and kind of where is this occurring? So when do we get kind of forest transitioning back to conifer dominated versus when do we have forest moving from conifer over to our aspen? And previous research has suggested that this type of transition may be particularly common when you have some sort of disturbance interaction. So where you have one prior disturbance followed by a fire event. And I'm going to present today just a case study looking at the potential for this to happen in spruce beetle affected forests. So this is a photo from the San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado, where you can see a really extensive spruce beetle outbreak. So this system was one where we thought that this type of transition might be particularly important because first, there's no serotiny in these trees, so we're depending upon live seed being dispersed in from the unburned edge. And two, this outbreak is really severe and particularly extensive. So in many of these stands, we're talking about 90% of the basal area being killed. So very little live seed sources in this system. Additionally, this outbreak preceded the fires by about 5 years. So a pretty big difference in timing here. So study I'll be talking about today is led by Robbie Andrus. And what he did is he sampled 45 plots across 6 fires in southwestern Colorado that burned in this West Fork fire complex, as well as the Little Sands fire and the East Fork fire. And the outbreak, like I was saying, it's at least 5 years post-fire. what we wanted to know is basically what the regeneration is happening in the system. Do we see that there still is some conifer regeneration, or are we seeing aspen? And if so, where is aspen regeneration occurring? So just real briefly to talk a little bit about his results, he found that initial post-fire densities of both spruce and fir were relatively low. We found very few seedlings. It was kind of depressing how few seedlings we did find, and when we did find them, they tended to be ones that were planted. This is particularly the case in areas where spruceville infestation was high prior to the fire, so the severity was really high. There's few surviving seed sources. However, the initial post-fire densities of fir were also low in this system, and that's probably a combination of the fact that there's very little fir in the system to begin with. So it may be different if you're thinking about kind of translating these results to maybe forests in northwestern Colorado, where there's a little bit larger component of fir in our spruce systems. But additionally, the post-fire climate in this environment following these fires was relatively hot and dry, and that may have limited establishment of fir as well. In contrast, when we think about aspen establishing in this system, we found that post-fire densities of aspen were much greater than conifer densities, particularly when aspen was nearby. So most of the aspen that we discovered was resprouting from stems that existed within the system. However, we did find that some of our aspen were heavily browsed by ungulates, as illustrated by this photograph here on the left. About 17% of them had their apical meristems clipped off, which is really reducing their capacity to recruit into the canopy. So we're suggesting that this may slow rates of canopy recovery, and a better understanding of where the impacts of ungulate herbivory are really high is important in thinking about how these forests may recover and the rate that they may recover. Nonetheless, in these systems where we have extensive spruce beetle outbreak and few surviving spruce, we're expecting that canopy composition may switch from conifer-dominated areas to aspen-dominated areas. And this may mean that aspen is really serving as an opportunity for adaptive resilience. So if aspen is persisting in these areas where conifer regeneration is failing, it may be an opportunity to maintain forest cover. However, this switch in the dominant forest cover may lead to shifts in things like disturbance regimes, biodiversity, ecosystem services, carbon cycling, lots of different consequences for how that ecosystem functions. Critically, from thinking about this for a fire perspective, aspen is often thought as being a fire break and less prone to widespread fire. So it may set up a system where we have less fire burning in here and aspen that's readily able to colonize post-fire. However, it seems like a trend here is for all of us to end with a lot of uncertainties, which probably highlights just how much we need all of you who are boots on the ground type of managers to help us out to figure out what you're observing. First, I think my uncertainties are just the role of herbivory. When does it play a role in shifting the rate of recovery? If you're only having about 20% browse, does that matter? Or is it perhaps being really important in areas where we have really low aspen or conifer density occurring in the system? We've observed that in some of the lower elevation, low density systems that even browsing by things like cows can be really impacting some of our sites, but it's hard to actually get estimates of those densities of animals that are present within the system. So when is that playing an important role? Second, when is aspen establishing from seed? Historically, we've thought that aspen establishing from seed hasn't been a particularly big driver. However, increasingly, as we're paying more attention to where it may be establishing, we're observing that this is occurring. So here, for instance, is Robbie holding up a photo, an aspen seedling that he dug out in these West Fork fires. We're continuing to understand that climate is affecting both seed production and establishment in our subalpine forests. We probably need to know a little bit more about this. And then just when and where are initial post-fire seedling densities predictive of our long-term trajectories? We often think that in many of our systems that what comes back initially post-fire is really a strong predictor of what that forest will look like in the future. But the longer we monitor some of these post-fire burned areas, we're realizing that what's there initially may not necessarily be predictive of these long-term trajectories, both in terms of the density of individuals present within a system, as well as the composition. So to reiterate what Chuck was saying, not only do we need to establish and monitor what's going on now following the 2020 fires for the next couple of years, but we really need to start thinking about how we can monitor things over longer time periods so we can understand when there may be shifts. And then last, just all the potential feedbacks that may occur between these different disturbances that are resulting in kind of these compound effects. We really have a hard time getting a handle on. So with that, I will just say thanks, and I would be happy to entertain any questions or comments if you have them.
Great, thanks very much, Sarah. And yeah, I don't see anything in the chat right now, but hopefully, let me see if I can open it up. If anybody's got their hand up, why don't you just jump up? I'll see if I can get the Hollywood Squares view going here and see who's got their hand raised. I'll have to call on somebody here in a minute.
You know, Chuck, I actually do see a question
Great.
from Suvan Cabral, excuse me if I've mispronounced that. What effects would a single species regeneration have on regional hydrology? And I'm not sure if that's specific for Sarah or not.
Sounds like a better question for Chuck.
Thank you. Suvan, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that, because I think a lot of these stands are not single species stands. So if something converted to another, if everything turned into lodgepole pine, or if everything turned into aspen, if that's what you're thinking about or speculating about, I'm sure that would have a huge change in terms of the timing and the amount of water use, because we know that water relations and water export out of watersheds is linked kind of by the amount that individual species take up per unit leaf area. And so lodgepole pine uses less than fir, and if it went in that direction, it would probably be different. Whether that's a possibility and something we might see, it's hard to know. And it's certainly an interesting thing to think about, and it sounds like a great modeling question. There are probably other people, I don't know, there are other hydrologists. Troy Ochiltree might have something to say about that, or somebody who thinks about ecophysiology or hydrology might want to chip in on that one.